So we're recording, right? So plan for today. We are going to cover this bad boy here, which is the OS security. And then after this, we just have one slide deck left, which we'll cover next Wednesday. And like I said, we would also have a quick chat about the exam format. So today we will cover this, then we'll probably take a 10-minute break or something. And then what I'll do is I'll just go through I'll just go through CA2. And if anybody has a question, no one sent me one yet, I'll go through them. But also I'll go through just a couple of things which I think are relevant as well. Right. So I'll keep an eye on the chat as we go along. So OS security. So let's have a peek at this one. So some of this is a little bit tricky if you haven't done security. So therefore I'll dumb it down a little bit in terms of the symmetric versus asymmetric stuff that a lot of you would have done last year with me. But there are some people in the room who didn't do security last year with me. So we have to be fair to everybody. So I'll do my best to keep it as non-mad technical as possible, but there's no way to really cover security on OS without getting somewhat technical. Right. Why do we need security on OS? Well, I think everybody knows at this stage why we need security on OS. Is if ransomware is probably one of the greatest examples of it. That if somebody gets in and gets at your servers, they can cause havoc, encrypt the whole stuff, your backups, everything. So it's becoming more and more and more important as the years go by. For my sins, I had to deal with this going back 10, 15, 20 years because of the products I used to work on. But it was not in mainstream computing. You wouldn't see it on servers as much. You wouldn't see it on home PCs as much. You wouldn't see it on phones as much. Whereas when we get into it, and I'll talk to you a little bit about it, it's everywhere at this stage, right? Security is key, and those phones you have in your hands, whether Apple or Android, they go through a huge amount of this stuff as they boot up. But we'll discuss that as we go on. Why do we need it? Do you remember CIA? That's from last year. But again, as I said to you, if you're ever answering a security question, make sure you bring in these three terms because they are highly relevant to anything to do with security. If I was in the lab, if I was in the room, we'd have a chat and I'd ask you what they were, but it's online, so it gets a little bit complicated. So CIA, confidentiality, integrity, and 3A's, availability, access, authorization. So confidentiality is reasonably straightforward. It's essentially, I have stuff, I don't want you to see it. Therefore, what's the best way of keeping something confidential? Say I was sending a message from me to you and I wanted to keep it confidential. What's the best way to keep that confidential? Can you remember? Or you wouldn't even have to remember, you could probably guess it. A message from me to you and I wanted to keep it confidential. Yeah, well done, Milan. Yeah, just so I got encrypted, right? And I said the CIA triangle is, you see this around a lot as well, and you will in your career see this around a lot. It's famous. And there's the three: availability. They pick one of the A's and put it up there. Integrity was the next one, and again, if I wanted to maintain integrity, can you remember what the integrity of a message meant? Or can anybody tell me what the integrity? If I want to maintain integrity, what do I mean? Anybody know what integrity means in this sense? Yeah, it hasn't been changed, hasn't been tampered with. Well done, Paul. Yeah, okay. So in other words, we use, and can you remember an algorithm we would have used to do that? How do we, what algorithms typically do we use to check for integrity? Do you remember that one? Now, if someone gets this, I'll take it. Oh, well done. I think I did a good job last year. Well done, Paul. Shot at 246. Yeah, that's the little bad boy. That is the modern one that's used. But previously SHA-1 was used, but that got broken. So the current recommendation is SHA-246. And then the last one, availability, access, authorization. That's essentially to do with making sure you can always get at your data when you want to, and your access is authorized and it's safe. In other words, so I'm logging into the bank, but it's me, so dual factor, things like that are used for that. And again, like 5-10 years ago, no one ever heard of dual factor. I had, because of the stuff I did, but now it's everywhere and people are glad it's everywhere. Although it is a bit of a pain that you have to get a text message to log in somewhere, but that's dual factor, and that's really. And as I said, you can bring this CIA triangle to everything you do security-wise in your life at the moment, right? And I say the current climate, malware, ransomware, we only need to look at the college to see what happened last year, okay? So very, very important. If you ever ask a security question, make sure you drag in the CIA triangle, okay? There are some other terms that are worth knowing. And again, you probably will come across these as you move on in your career, especially if you do anything in security. So, obviously it's on the next slide, but TCB is one that is very, very important. And what it means is a trusted computing base, right? And there's a mouthful there, a combination of hardware, software, and controls that work together to form a trusted base to enforce your well, blah. In English, if you build your house on dodgy foundations, it'll most likely fall down. So in other words, you could have, the easiest way to explain this is, you could have the best on your phone or on your PC, you could have the best security written applications in the world. They could be brilliant, right? They could be dual factor anytime you use this application. They could be encrypting to be chases out of all your data, brilliant. But if your OS is not secured, it's a waste of time, because if you get in at the OS, you're getting in underneath the applications, and you most likely have root permissions or higher permissions than the application has, and you can get at the application's data, and you can probably decrypt it. So what a trusted computing base means that from the ground up, from the time you boot your device, it's highly secure, right? And usually what it means is the lower down you go, the higher secure stuff is used, right? So to give you an example, your phone, when that boots up, there's many layers of software as your phone boots up, whether it's an Apple or whether it's an Android, right? There's, within its simplest term, there's most likely a bootloader layer, and there's an operating system layer, and there's applications, right? I think we all probably can agree. There's probably more, right? But those three definitely. And what I'm trying to explain to you is the bootloader layer will not boot the operating system unless it does integrity checks and make sure that the operating system hasn't been tampered with, right? And it does that via, do you remember digital signatures and public and private keys? Again, people who were with me last year will remember this, other people mightn't. But essentially what it's doing is, before the bootloader will run the OS, it will check its signature is valid. And if it is valid, it'll run the OS. And then before the OS runs any application, it will check the signatures on those applications to make sure that they are okay. So in other words, no piece of software runs on your phone unless you're jailbreaking it, right? No piece of software runs on your phone unless it has been securely checked. That's essentially a trusted computing base, and that's a proper secure solution. So that's most phones and any payment device that you'll use your cards on in the shops, right? They will all do that. However, your standard PC hasn't reached that level yet, right? As you know, you can install apps on your laptop or whatever on your computer, and they'll run. And that's usually the biggest risk, isn't it? We all know that. And the problem is you don't know where the stuff came from, right? And it's not getting signature checked. So that's quite a big problem. And as I say, home PCs haven't reached the level of full security yet. I have a feeling they will. They'll all become like phones at some stage, pretty soon probably. But as I say, you know that if your phone isn't jailbreaking or broken or whatever word you want to use to describe that, you can only install legitimate apps. And what they mean is those apps have been checked and signed, and your phone will guarantee that they haven't been tampered with since they've been signed. Okay, so that's very, very important there. Hope you understood that. Where are we now? TPM, another term. And we know what TPM is. Well, it's a trusted platform module. So it's all very well to say we'll have a TCB, but how do you actually do all these signature checks before you boot stuff? And I should say, nobody actually pointed it out, I said the bootloader checks the OS, but who checks the bootloader? All right. Remember what I said, if you get in at the lowest level, so if we go back here for a second, if you get in at the lowest level, you're going to have a problem. So if I manage to get in at my bootloader level, sure, I could load whatever OS I wanted. So actually the bootloader is also checked before it runs. And you'll wonder, how could it do that, right? Well, the bootloader is usually stored, the base bootloader is usually stored in, believe it or not, it's blown into some memory that's in the processor, right? And what's in there, without getting too technical about it, is essentially a public key. And what happens is before it boots, it checks a signature, and you know you can use check a signature with a public key if you're with me last year. So to cut a long story short, the bootloader checks itself before it runs. Okay, and you can't change it because the actual bootloader, the very lowest bootloader, is stored in the memory in the chip, the processor chip. So it's not a separate chip. Okay. So just to give you an idea, trusted platform module. What is that? It's actually a name for a secure crypto processor. Again, what is that? You asked me. Well, I've been talking about, you know, checking signatures and encrypting stuff and things like that. What this is, trying to dumb it down, is like a partner processor that's in a PC or a phone or whatever, and it does all the crypto stuff, and it keeps all the secret keys secret. And if you try and see that last sentence there, if you try to break into that chip or take the top off that chip and try and read the memory out in that chip, and people do this, by the way, it's tamper resistant. So if you try to do that, it deletes all its memory and keys, so you can never get the keys. You'll render the device dead, but at least you won't get the secret keys. So essentially that's what a secure crypto processor is, or a trusted platform module, if you look it up. All right. So what I need you to remember is it's this little piece of hardware, a chip or whatever, that typically sits on a motherboard, on a PCB with the main processor, and it's doing all the crypto stuff, and it has all the secrets in there, and if you attack it, it deletes its keys. Okay, that's essentially what I need you to get out of it. And as we'll see, there are many different types of those. So why might we need it? Well, as I said, you know, the people who were with me last year will understand some of those terms. The people who weren't won't. So all I really want you to remember is it keeps all the secret keys secret, and it does all the crypto that you want in the device. Okay, and it helps you enforce that trusted computing base, whereby you check and you don't run any software as you boot up without checking its signature. All right. I'm not gonna ask you what the hell these are, because it's not fair on the people who didn't. So you won't see these. I won't ask you what a TPM content is in an exam. I might ask you what a TPM is, but I won't ask you to reproduce something like this because it's not fair on the people. But the people who will be last year will see terms like random number generator, RSA key generator, SHA-1 hash generator, and there's all sorts of keys there, right? And there's, you know, that's the keys. Again, I'm not going to get into that because it's beyond the scope of some of the people who are in the room. Essentially, what I would need you to remember is, as I said, it keeps the secret keys secret, and it does all the crypto stuff for you. All right. So this is important now. TPM types. What sort of types are there? These trusted modules, right? There's discrete. What that means is discrete means usually separate, right? It's a separate chip on the motherboard. As I said, it's tamper-proof. So it's essentially a hardware implementation of all the algorithms and all that sort of stuff. Minimal software issues. So in other words, if you use this solution, you're not going to be upgrading it, right? It's usually proven. It's been around for a long time. Its downside is it costs more because it's a separate chip, all right? But that's what a discrete one is. An integrated one, and I use a lot of these because we use processors that were heavily designed to be tamper-proof and things like that. It's part of the processor chip. When it doesn't have to be tamper-proof, but a lot of times in a very high security device, it is. But if it's part of the processor chip, it doesn't have to be tamper-proof because it can be buried so far deeply in the processor chip, and the processor chip these days are so complicated that even if you lifted the top off the chip and you try to scan to see where the keys were, you wouldn't be able to do it, all right? It costs too much money. So they don't have to be tamper-proof, but some of them are. Firmware, again, firmware is a fancy word for low-level software. Software solution running parallel to the OS, vulnerable to software bugs. So what that means is, as distinct from this one, these two, if you use these two, you're accepting that whatever I have in the crypto algorithm land that are built into these, I'm not going to change them, right? Because let's face it, it's probably impossible to change them. Whereas this one, my whole TPM solution is a software solution. So it's all written in software. So unfortunately, as we know, if something is written in software, it's vulnerable, right? Because it's written by humans and therefore they make mistakes. So the software bugs. So if you have that, it's more flexible than these two. But Unfortunately, that comes with downsides as well. More flexible names, you probably make more mistakes, and you have to upgrade it more often. Virtual is typically you can find these buried in hypervisor layers. It's still very similar to that one. And then this last one is usually used for when if you're in the business of developing one of these TPMs, you will develop the whole thing in high level software first, okay? And it's used for development. Okay, so hopefully you get the rough idea what I'm talking about there, all right? So, just a quick word on TPM version 1 versus 2. We said that security uses the likes of, these are algorithms used for encryption and signing and all that sort of jazz that people with me last year will know. One of the main reasons for TPM version 2, we've already mentioned it. Can anybody think what it might have been? Have a guess? I'll give you a clue. The last few comments are very close to it. No guesses. So TPM version 1 was using SHA-1. So obviously yeah, exactly. Well done, Luke. So SHA-1 had to go, so therefore TPM version 2 mandates SHA-256. Okay, right. As I said, it used to be you could have said, oh, this is all very well, Pearson, it's all very well for you and your payment terminals, and obviously it's required for payment terminals, but I'm not interested in my, why do we have to learn it? And as I said, well, you have to learn it because it's a fact of life now. As I said, all your phones do this. A lot of PC servers do what's called, anybody ever heard of secure boot? Well, a lot of them do secure boot, which is essentially the OS is checked before it's run, okay? But unfortunately, the applications aren't checked yet on all PCs, but I guarantee you it's coming, right? But TPM compliance for Windows 10, blah, blah, blah. I'm not going to read all that. You can have a read of it. You can see there, Google on Chromebooks, TPM is on. So everything is checked. Windows do the same as they always do, which is they tell you it's on, but actually it's optional whether you turn it on or not. All right. So again, a good read there if you want to have a read of that and understand a little bit more about this. But the main point is it's here and it's coming as well at the same time. Okay. So hopefully you got it. So in summary, eventually all our blah 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 will use some form of TCM to control secure boot. Most of them are doing that already. Secure running of applications. Your phones are definitely doing that already, and your tablets are doing that. Securing data at rest and on transit. So that's where we're going to end up. Everything is secured. Okay, not quite there yet. Right, another important term we need to know if we're doing OS security, a thing called OS hardening. So there's a wonderful paragraph there of lots of words, but essentially what you're trying to do is you're trying to reduce an OS's surface of vulnerability. So in other words, you're trying to make it less vulnerable, okay? So you're trying to make it essentially simpler. Remember I used to tell you simple is good, and that if you have something that's simple, then it's got less it's got less vulnerabilities, yeah? But it's the same thing. You're trying to make an OS. If you install a vanilla OS, right, just straight out of the tin, there's a lot of stuff turned on by default that maybe you don't need, right? Ports open, stuff allowed, remote logins allowed, things like that, right? Maybe the passwords are set to defaults. Big issue with this was routers. Everybody has a router in their home at this stage. It used to be that those routers to get into them, all you had to type was admin, and there's a lot of them I think still out there. So dangerous because essentially anybody can get into them and then use them as a computer, because most of those routers are embedded Linux machines, so they're essentially Linux PCs, right? So very, very dangerous. So anyway, the message is, if you want to build a secure machine, you need to harden the OS as well. So you can't just install a vanilla OS. You need to think about some things you might want to do to harden it. And the typical things we want to do is, we're going to get to them there, right? But this is the point. Just want to get off and jump in. Hang on a second. Sorry, too warm. Okay, this is actually an important point, right? it's all very well to say, oh, we should harden the bejesus out of everything, right? Well, the good side is if you harden stuff, then it makes it more secure. So, for instance, if you have stuff running in the cloud, you want that, and it's your production stuff, you want that to be really, really hardened, okay? So you want to make sure that if I'm running stuff for customer A versus customer B, the customer B can't see customer A's data and vice versa, blah, blah, blah. So it makes perfect sense to harden the bejesus out of those installations, right? But it mightn't suit everybody's corporate desktop or home machine or laptop. So when you're working when you're out there working, right, you will want to be flexible. You won't like it if the IT people say, well, that thing's totally clamped down and you can only install X, Y, Z on it and blah, 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 blah. Right? You want, especially if you're a developer, you'll want to have a certain amount of flexibility. So there's always a trade-off. And remember, again, the people I had last year, remember I mentioned this triangle from last year called an SUF triangle. Remember that? Security, usability, functionality. It's a trade-off, okay? If you move the ball towards the security vertex of the triangle, then you get less functionality and less usability, right? So it's always a trade-off, so be careful of that. All right? So if you want to harden an OS, this is typically what you would do. As I say, you'll find many lists of how to harden an OS out there. There's a sample list here from that, I think. But essentially, this is typically what you would do. So in other words, you would get rid of every unnecessary program that you don't need. For instance, remote desktop is a famous one in Windows land that if you leave it on, it's very dangerous. Obviously, you keep up to date with service packs and patches. That's a lot easier now because that's all automated. And you install and configure firewalls, even though there might be a firewall protecting you, you might also have a firewall turned on the machine itself. Antivirus, intrusion detection systems, intrusion protection, we mentioned these as well last year, and keep those up to date. Disable groups sharing data unless explicitly required. So typically when you create a new group on Linux, and most people don't, just take this for granted, right? But you remember in Linux you have these user group and other permissions. Well, if you look closely when you create new stuff, your group permissions are probably set to read, which means if someone created a group with you and someone else, they can read your stuff, all right? So you can turn that off. So in other words, you should turn it off unless you explicitly require it. But the default, believe it or not, if you and me were both in a group on a Linux machine, you would be able to read my stuff. Okay, so be careful with that. Enforce strong password rules. So we all hate these password rules where you have to have, a capital letter, numbers, other letters, special characters, blah blah blah, and it has to be 8 long. We all hate it, but actually, it's very, very, very important that you do that. And as I mentioned to you last year, unfortunately, there's still a problem with that, which is, and we'll see, can you remember what this is? If I were to ask you, you probably all have many accounts on many company servers out there, from Amazon to wherever you buy stuff from, or blah blah blah. If I were to ask you what's your username on nearly all those accounts, what would you answer? Go on, what would you answer? What's your username? Yeah, it's your email, right? And here's your next question. So I reckon nobody likes having 50 million different passwords for all these different sites. So let me guess, you probably use a password that has a capital letters, numbers, and special characters, but you probably use the same one for all those sites, yeah? Would that be a fairly correct assumption? So Luke is, fair play to you, Luke. Well, a lot of people, right, you guys mightn't because you guys have been educated by me and you also are a techie, but a lot of people use, yeah, well done, Jen, Rachel. A lot of people do this, and unfortunately, on their machine, then if you are on their machine, a lot of times you might be able to find out what their password is if you are looking into Google settings, blah blah blah, or some muppet also sometimes gives it to you. And the issue is, if you get it, you probably can get into all their sites. All right, so you have to be really, really, really careful. But strong password rules. If you're setting up a server, make sure you do that. Disable all ports by the ones agreed in the security policy. Fair enough. You don't want ports open that shouldn't be open. Instruct good backup. That's your only defense against ransomware, by the way. And unfortunately, ransomware typically goes looking for your backups as well and encrypts that. But you have to have some sort of backup policy to have a chance, and then encrypt all sentences. So they are just a sample list of OS hardening steps. So the main message is, if you ever have to set up a server and someone tells you we need this to be secure, this is the type of stuff you got to make sure you do. All right. Don't just stick in a vanilla operating system. So next thing is, well, that's all very well, but can we do more stuff here, right? And the answer is yes. We could usually use a thing called mandatory access control. So there's mandatory access control and there's discretionary access control. That's what DAC is, right? Discretion. What does that mean? Discretion means you can only decide. It only happens if you decide to give your permission. So an example of discretionary. So we're going to discuss these two. So an example of discretionary access control, mean of restricting access to objects based on the identity of the subjects, right? So in other words, subject. So this is very simple. This is based on a person's user. They get access to stuff or not. And we've seen this already. And it's basically the standard Unix permissions, right? Do you remember the deal? This is user, these three are group, these are other, right? And when a permission is not set, the corresponding rights are denied. So actually, I'll just show you that. Just wanted to show you what I meant there. And this, wake up. Okay, so if I go in here, right, and I go make dir temp. Okay, do you see the permissions it gave temp? It gave me, the user, read write access, read write execute access. But look what it did for group, and look what it did for other. Okay, so what that means is, if I was in a group with somebody, they would be able to read everything and execute stuff I have in my directory. They wouldn't be able to write to it, they wouldn't be able to change it. So what I'm trying to say to you is, what you should really be doing is, if you want to really harden it, is you would have something like that. Okay, which is now only I have full permissions, and you can change that. You can change the settings so the default is 700, right? So you do have to be careful, just to warn you. Okay, so I'm not going to read all those right there. You've done those before at this stage, but if you haven't, you can figure them out yourselves. They're fairly straightforward, right? The whole point is the user themselves decides who can see what. Like, I can override it, I can allow it. I could make it 777 if I wanted to, right? The point is, it's up to me. Okay, that's DAC. It's discretionary, at my discretion. So MAC is different. MAC is mandatory access control, and to explain it simply, it means I can do what I want. I could decide that. So let's see that there. I have a I have a script there I call pause, right? So if I run pause .sh, right? No, I didn't put in that. Okay, sleeps for 5 seconds. We all agree that. Fine. So, and if we look at it closely, we see that pause has 700. Well, I could actually change that to be at my discretion 777, right? And now it's 777. So that is me basically saying anybody on the system could run that script, yeah? Well, mandatory access essentially says, well, no matter what you do at the discretionary level, there's a higher level, right, controlled by an admin person who decides it doesn't matter what the discretionary provisions are. I will decide, the admin decides who gets access to what, right? And this is used a lot in really high secure devices, right? So in other words, I've used things like this in those secure payment devices. So if you imagine one of those secure payment devices, right, and it has, you use them all the time when you tap, which you think, right? It has a little screen, it has a keypad, it has card readers, for instance, right? So you can tap or you can put the chip card in, right? So what mandatory access control means is, for instance, at a discretionary level, you might say, oh, this application has access to the screen and has access to the card reader. But if at a higher level, you say, nobody has access to the screen and the card reader, except the application that is responsible for PIN entry or the application that is responsible for doing the actual payment, right? Because there'll be lots of applications in one of those units, right? They're not all accessing the card reader and accessing the screen. So you can, at a high level, decide only these few pieces of software that are really highly controlled and written by maybe just these few people over here, and they have their own way of signing it so that only they can control that piece of software. You can basically say you can't get at certain things, ports, drivers, whatever. Okay, so that's essentially what mandatory access control does. It restricts access to an object from a subject. Typically, the subject is a process or a thread, not the user. So in other words, typically what you're saying is a process can only access something or not. Object is typically a file, a directory, a port, or a driver. So for instance, the LCD driver, I could say I have 20 applications on this device. 19 of them are not allowed access to the LCD. One of them, the one that does PIN entry, that can put up a message to enter your PIN, only that one can access the LCD. Even if those applications have been set up with discretionary access 777, the mandatory access controller can come along on top and say, you're not getting at the LCD. Okay. Attempted accesses are checked with a policy file. That's what controls who's allowed to do what, to determine pass or fail. What's different from DAC? Well, I think it's obvious at this stage. The policy is controlled by someone above you, not just the user. So the permissions are not at the user's discretion, hence the name difference. So hopefully you get that. If not, listen back to the video. Historically, for obvious reasons, popular in military systems, okay, because Big Brother. And the gas thing is, Mac on Linux started out from the military. We'll talk about that in a few minutes. Far more mainline now. There are two what's called LSMs. They are Linux security modules that perform Mac, right? You can get two of them. You can probably get more at this stage, but these are the two big boys. AppArmor and SE Linux. You can also get it on Windows, mandatory integrated control, but I hate Windows, so I don't teach Windows, right? So these are the two biggies, big boys in the park for Linux security modules that implement Mac, right? So we'll have a little chat about those. So what is a Linux security module? It's a framework allowing the Linux kernel to support different security modules. So you might want to use different LSMs to do your Mac. You mightn't like one versus the other. And I know people say, why would you need two? Well, you're going to find out in a minute why there's two. So the important point is it's modular. So I can have a Linux operating system and I can decide to use the LSM from company A, or actually I don't trust them, I'll use the LSM from company B, or I'll write my own LSM. You can do that, all right? You can plug different ones in, and it's not tied to one LSM. It's part of the kernel since a long time ago, and these are the two. There are two because Linux nerds couldn't agree on one, and they didn't trust the creator of SE Linux. So we have AppArmor and SE Linux. So can you guess, without looking at the next slide, can you guess who created SE Linux that maybe people don't trust? Anybody? A wild guess. The clue was earlier when I said it was very popular in military circles. Any ideas? Put you in a misery. Or will I? Is it there? Created by the NSA. Essentially, yeah. Well done. You're very close. Well done, Reese. You got it. So anyway, we'll have a quick chat about these, right? AppArmor. An LSM that restricts posts to give and say, okay, we know that at this stage, that's how it works. It was originally created by actually a crowd called the SUSE Linux distro. Now this SUSE, the SUSE Linux distro still exists. Some people use it. Most people go with, I'd say, Fedora or Ubuntu / Debian at this stage, but SUSE also exists, and they created this one actually. Restricts the process, right? We know how to do it. Can run into this. These are actually interesting. Can run in 2 modes. It can be mixed, which can be mixed. Enforcement mode, which is if you do something wrong, it gets enforced and logged. So in other words, if I am an application and I don't have access to the LCD or the screen, and I try to write to the screen, the stuff won't come out on the screen, and it gets logged that I did it. Okay, it might send a message, automated message somewhere central, or it might just kill the application. Depends on what the policy is. This is a very, very handy mode, right? This complain mode. Say you had a piece of old software that had been around for years, and you suddenly decided you wanted to use AppArmor to control what it did, but you weren't sure. You know, it's a large piece of software. You weren't sure what it accessed, right? So what you do is you write a policy that says can't access anything, no drivers, no nothing, and then you run it. And what happens is it's allowed to do what it wants, but every time it accesses something, it gets logged, and you can then see immediately what it's actually accessing. So it's a very handy mode, and then you can decide what you actually want it not to get at and want to get at. All right, so very handy about that. It's been in the mainline for a long time, 10 years. I'm not sure what the Linux kernel. What's the current Linux kernel? 5.7, right? So it's been around for quite a while. Okay, learn more. You can have a look at those. As I say, I'm never going to ask you anything that's in any of these links. They're just really to give you more information if you want more information. Okay, so that's AppArmor. SE Linux. This is the one that people didn't trust because our friends created it. And the main difference between this and AppArmor is it allows for a finer control of policy. So in other words, you can really get into this and say, oh, I want to do this but not this, and things like that. It's commonly viewed a little bit overcomplicated, and it's harder to admin because you have this finer grain of control of policies, right? It is more mature than AppArmor. But there's one main reason why SE Linux has an advantage over AppArmor. AppArmor is easier to use, but SE Linux has one major advantage. It's been around actually since even longer than AppArmor, and it's popular in Linux containers. And here's the big advantage, right? It's available for Fedora, Ubuntu, like Red Hat is just Fedora anyway, and it's available for both, right? Whereas this fella, unfortunately, is not supported by Fedora. All right, so AppArmor is not supported on Fedora. So if you have a Fedora distribution or a Red Hat distribution, you can't use AppArmor. You have to use SE Linux if you want to use an LSM. That's the big disadvantage of it, okay? But this one is harder to admin. Okay, so again, if you want more info, it's there. So if we just have a quick look at the summary, they all do lots of stuff, right? They're the same on lots of stuff there. And where they differ is SE Linux is harder to learn because it's more complicated. And similarly, that's why it's not so easy to use, or it's easier. And this is the biggest difference actually. You don't have, it's available for everything, SE Linux, so Fedora, Ubuntu, SUSE, whereas this one is just Debian, Ubuntu, and SUSE. Okay, so that's essentially the message. So that's the security stuff we wanted to do. So it boils down to, you need to know what's an LSM, you need to know Mac, DAC, you need to know the difference between AppArmor and SE Linux. What else do you need to know? You need to know how to harden an OS, and you need to know what a TPM is and a TCB. Okay, so that's basically what you need to know. All right, so any questions on that? Right, so it's 9:58. So 10 past 10, take a 10-minute break there and just grab yourself a glass of water or something, coffee or tea or whatever you're drinking at this hour. And at 10 past 10, we'll have a quick chat about CA2. Okay? I'll kill this video and I'll do a new video for that one. So I'll see you at 10 past 10.